Hi, and welcome everyone. This is sort of a new idea for us at the Ivey Foundation. There's so much going on right now in terms of climate change, economic issues, the changing face of the country. And we thought this would be a great opportunity to get together with some of the people that we really see as the experts in the country who understand these issues deeply, and many people that we work with in the media who are covering these stories right now in a great way. And really the idea for us is to combine the ideas of a climate crisis together with a competitiveness crisis in this country, and how do those things fit together. So my name's Bruce Lourie. I'm the president of the Ivey Foundation, and it's a pleasure to be here in Ottawa on such a beautiful day. And I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, and their presence has been here back to time immemorial. So thank you for having us. The Ivey Foundation is a charitable foundation. We're based in Toronto. We've been around for 75 years, so we're one of the older philanthropic organizations in the country. And starting about 10 years ago, we really looked at how we were dealing with the environment basically as a country. We've been an environmental funder for essentially 40 years. And what struck us was so many environmental issues are stuck because we haven't actually understood, or we haven't done a good job of presenting the environment within the context of the economy more broadly. An economy meaning jobs, competitiveness, trade, etc. And it's taken us a number of years, I would say close to 10 years, to really start to develop an understanding and a base of organizations that we're now supporting that are doing just an outstanding job. And representatives from those organizations are here today, and I'll point them out a little bit later. But essentially, our framing around these issues has arrived at this idea of the major transition pathways that this country has to remain competitive and create the jobs of the future while we decarbonize. Some of the organizations that we work closely with are here today. I just want to point out the Canadian Climate Institute, the Transition Accelerator, Efficiency Canada, Institute for Sustainable Finance, the Clean Economy Fund, Smart Prosperity Institute, Accelerate, Seed Change, National Farmers Union, the Fortier Family Foundation, the Canadian Steel Producers, the Cement Association, and the Forest Products Association of Canada. So some of those groups are close partners and organizations we fund, others are research groups we work closely with, and others are, of course, industry associations that are an important part of the solution. So I would encourage members of the media who are here, and thank you so much for coming, to stay for the reception following our briefing. And we're going to try to be as tight as possible, warning you that we do have academics who tend to talk for a long time, but Bentley knows that he won't this time. Just kidding. We're super excited to have a great panel here, but I do encourage you to stay right to the end. We will have some drinks and food and a reception for all of us here today. So, as I said, the purpose today is really to acknowledge that in addition to the great reporting that we're seeing these days on the climate crisis, and I think increasing reporting connecting economy and environment and the climate, we really want to dig down into what does it look like for Canada's future to actually create a decarbonized economy? What does it mean for competitiveness, for trade, for job creation, for challenges across the country in different regions where it's going to be a much harder task in some parts of the country than others, of course. We're going to hear from several speakers, three in fact, all working exactly on this issue. And I would like to now introduce them and welcome them to the stage. So first, Dr. Bentley Allan. Bentley is a research director at the Transition Accelerator. Bentley is also associate professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore and but is a Canadian and has returned today for this event. Catherine Cobden. Thanks, Catherine. I've known and worked with Catherine for many, many years. One of the leading lights in the industry association world of Canada, President and CEO of the Canadian Steel Producers Association. And last but not least, Matthew Fortier. Thanks, Matthew. Matthew is President and CEO of Accelerator Canada, which is a zero-emission vehicle supply chain alliance. Thanks so much for all of you, and we're going to start with Bentley. And I just want to acknowledge that Bentley, since we probably first started working with you less than a year ago, I'm going to say, has been extraordinarily influential in how we see the world and the issues that we're working on. So thanks so much, Bentley, for that. In addition to all of that great work, Bentley is an award-winning scholar, has written on the dynamics of international order, science and politics, climate policy, and the political economy of decarbonization. And as I said, he is working with the Transition Accelerator right now to help us build out decarbonization roadmaps and transition pathways, and ultimately really look at how do we develop net zero industrial policy in this country. Bentley, I'm going to start off just by asking you if you can please outline to us what you see as the threat to Canada's economic competitiveness, and maybe you can share the results of some of your research on how Canada can position itself and position our industry to succeed as the world transitions to a net zero future.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. And thank you to all the folks who worked really hard on this event, Carrie and Jess and Lauren and Andrea. So it's really great to be back in Ottawa. I grew up just down Highway 7 near Perth, Ontario. So coming back to Ottawa really feels like a homecoming. So I'm really pleased to be here. So I want to make 3 arguments about why Canada needs to take a more strategic approach to forestall the kind of economic emergency which Bruce mentioned a few moments ago. And the first is really to think about our position in the world as a small open economy. As a small open economy, we're really dependent on our exports. And our number one export is, of course, oil and gas. And in 2019, last year, with a full year, we exported $120 billion worth of oil and gas. And we need to start thinking really seriously about what happens to Canada's economic health as that number declines. In order to make up the shortfall, we have to go down the rest of the export table and really think about how we're going to increase each of those next categories on the export table. That'll include ores and metals, forestry products, cars, automotive parts, agricultural goods, aircraft, and chemicals. Now, the good news is we have opportunities in each of those areas in the net zero transition. But we have to increase their export share at the very same time that each of those industries is being completely revolutionized by the energy transition. And this is the second argument. Net zero changes everything. This is a phrase that the president and CEO of Transition Accelerator, Dan Whitlam, says all the time. And the energy transition is not just disrupting the way that energy is produced, it's disrupting the way that we produce chemicals, fertilizers, the way that we are structuring aluminum and steel markets, the way that we structure cement markets. It's restructuring everything, not just the energy system as a whole. And if that wasn't enough, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has taught us that basically climate policy, energy security, and geopolitics are now completely interwoven with each other and inseparable from one another. Dependence on China and Russia for critical inputs into net zero supply chains is no longer tenable. Imagine being in a war with China over Taiwan and having Ford's battery supply chain threatened by the resulting economic decoupling. But that's exactly the kind of crisis that we're headed for, because Ford has a key strategic alliance with CATL, the biggest Chinese battery manufacturer. To avoid being left behind while reconfiguring supply chains to make them more geopolitically resilient, the government has to take a much more active role in defining what success looks like for the entire economy and creating a framework for strategic, robust action. But firms have to step up too. They have to take the long-term view, they have to collaborate with governments, and they have to learn to collaborate with each other in order to create strategies for each of these sectors. And we have to take this strategic approach because if we don't act now, then Canada is going to be shut out of rapidly forming global value chains. China, South Korea, the United Kingdom, the European Union, Australia, and the United States, all our major trading partners and competitors, are using industrial strategies to position their economies in the same net zero supply chains that Canada is trying to position itself in. And the Inflation Reduction Act really needs to sharpen our minds here, okay? The consensus view seems to be that the Inflation Reduction Act is basically good for Canadian business. And it's true that it'll provide demand pull in a couple of key important sectors. But actually, if we're not careful and really, really smart about it, the bill could actually set Canada back. The bill has really large credits for hydrogen, CCUS, clean energy, and mineral processing. And these credits raise a serious question about what the investment case in Canada is when you have the investment case in the United States that we're seeing. Up till now, like, our relatively clean electricity grid has delivered a green investment advantage, but that edge could evaporate in the face of a really rapid wind and solar and storage build out in the United States. And why would anyone do carbon capture and utilization and storage or direct air capture in Alberta when they could get $85 a ton or $185 a ton to do the same in Texas? Even if Alberta has a long-term geologic asset in the form of those reservoirs, all of the early innovation, all of the startups will move south to catch that early tax credit boom. The innovation ecosystem will be down there, the value added will be down there, and the analogy I would draw is we just become a reservoir for CO2 in the same way that we are just a producer of raw logs that we ship to China out of the forestry industry on the coast of BC. So, you know, we could say the same thing about hydrogen, about sustainable aviation fuel, and about just about every other technology now in the clean tech sector. Now, not to put too fine a point of it, but basically this could reduce us back to being the kind of staple economy, the kind of, you know, hewers of wood and drawers of water, caricature that is often drawn of Canada. That could be what the future of Canada in net zero supply chains looks like if we're not really careful. We could be providing biomass and forestry products, but all the secondary manufacturing value added would move to the United States. That would be a major economic crisis for this country, and it would mean that the dream of turning Canada into a clean tech powerhouse would be basically dead. So we can't really be lulled into complacency on the economic front the same way that we were lulled into complacency, even though scientists were warning us that the climate emergency, that forest fires, that floods, that these effects were going to come. We can't be lulled into the same complacency we were lulled into by thinking that that time horizon was well in the future, right? The economic crisis is going to arrive, and when it arrives, we need to be ready for it. So what would a more strategic approach look like in Canada? So first, I just want to define industrial policy really quickly. You know, it's really any intentional effort to create or build or shape industry. And the key here is that industrial policy is often conflated with its, top-down centralized bureaucratic variants. But actually, what we've seen over the last 30 years is the development of a wide range of modern industrial policies, which are really, what we're really talking about here is a strategic collaboration between government and industry. That process of working together to create a target, create a supply chain strategy, that's what modern industrial strategy looks like. It doesn't look like the government coming in ham-fisted and picking winners. That's an old, outdated view of what industrial policy is and can be, and it's not what I would propose for Canada. In Canada, if we look broadly at international best practices, and this is where my research is coming into the conversation here, Canada really needs a strategy with 4 key elements. The first is bold and clear targets. Canada needs what we're calling net zero competitiveness goals in priority opportunity areas. The goals there means quantitative economic targets that specify clear physical actions, improvement, production, and deployment of technologies that we need across sectors in order to reach decarbonization goals. This would be a nice physical, concrete complement to the targets that are in the emissions reduction plan, which are great, but they're mostly modeling artifacts and they don't refer to the real economy. So they don't give us a map into how we actually produce the outcomes that we want to produce. The second element of a Canadian industrial strategy would be those actual supply chain strategies, which are co-produced by government, business, First Nations, civil society, expertise, all working together. And it's really those new forms of collaboration that is the third aspect of it. It's creating a process where we can get really good information flows going between the government and the private sector. That's the key to good industrial strategy. The government has to know enough that it can take an active role, right? But not be only getting its information from the industry associations and from the industry themselves. There have to be experts at the table that can help the government differentiate between what's going to strategically make sense for the country and how we're going to take a long-term view and open things up. And to create really good information flows, Independent organizations work really well for that. In the European Commission, they use an organization called InnoEnergy, which is a big public-private partnership that has both Accelerator, like business expertise, but also it has decarbonization expertise, lots of engineers working for it. And it works really well in facilitating information flows between the government and the industry, and helps to really drive investment. And the last key piece of an industrial strategy would be actually going into each sector one by one and creating a mix of policies and fiscal tools that allow for those sectors to be activated and for action to be catalyzed really quickly. But then once you're in each of those sectors, you start to realize, whoa, actually steel is really closely connected to all these other industries because they're both drawing on hydrogen and they both need clean power. So you have to get up out of those sectors and up to the system level and start to make policy at the system level. The nickel, there's a pull here. The nickel wants to go into the steel supply chain, but we also need it in the battery supply chain. So we need policies in order to incentivize those resource flows in the same direction. So getting to that strategic policy discussion is the final element and one of the most difficult elements. But the key is just to start with a clear and bold target so we know where we're going and build collaboration on top of that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bentley. Catherine, Bentley kind of ended off with clearly some implications for the steel sector, and you're the national voice of our $15 billion steel sector in this country. I wonder if you could comment on how you see the role of industrial competitiveness and some of the ideas that Bentley's talking about with respect to your industry.
That's great. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Bentley. They're very interesting. And I think there's going to be some key themes that emerge from my comments as well, that's key overlaps for sure. So really great pleasure to be here. Appreciate the opportunity. And I want to commend Ivey for bringing the competitiveness considerations into the discussion. It is long overdue. And I think by what we've just heard from Bentley here, we can see the depth of the issues. And so well done to Bruce and the team for bringing this forward. So my task is to share with you a few points from the steel industry related to competitiveness and the challenges that we're struggling with. And I am trained as a communicator to always talk about the opportunities. And in this case, I am going to focus in on the challenges because we do have some. And I'm going to use steel-related examples, but I think they would apply to many other aspects of our economy. Challenge number one, how are we going to ensure that we can attract the investment we need to transform industries of the scale of transformation required to reach net zero? And Bentley touched on this. My own industry, I'm very proud of them. They've announced $3 billion worth of investment in partnership with others, but a lot of their skin's in the game. They're going to achieve 45% reduction in emissions by 2030, which I think surpasses the federal target, also leads the world globally in the steel industry. And yet, we have a long way to go. So how are we going to get that last major investment happening in this country? We definitely feel that we are in a race for the investment dollar. We only have to look at President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act to see that. And we are certain that, in the global steel world, we need, while Canada can't possibly, I don't think, meet the scale of the IRA, we have to keep pace with that to ensure we get the necessary investments. And we also have to consider the best sort of balance, if you will, of hosting conditions. So, do we have the predictable regulatory environment that creates the investment climate? And do we have the right suite of incentives, et cetera? Without that, I think it will be harder and harder for our industry and probably all heavy industries to remain competitive. So this is rather urgent. Challenge number two. Today, Canadian steel is the greenest steel produced, amongst the greenest steel we say, because the Americans have one small piece where they're greener. But in general, we are the greenest in the world. But today, as in every day, we are not the preferred supplier to many, many projects right across our country. Unfortunately, our country is built on a procurement path that basically does not consider carbon or greenhouse gas emissions in the least. So we believe that we need to think about how do we improve market share for green producers. And I'm not saying Canadian producers, although that is a certain advantage for us today, but for green production overall. We think this is going to get worse, and we see a significant challenge in the steel industry, as China is the most carbon intensive producer on the planet. They're about 2.5 times just at scope 1 and scope 2 of our industry's emissions. And they have a long way to come to get to Canada. And furthermore, they also produce way more steel than they need. Their extra steel that is looking for a market is about 42 times the entire Canadian production, period. So that's the scale of the challenge. So we believe every effort must be made to level the carbon playing field. And by this, we mean let's look at complementary policies between things like tariffs at the border for carbon, where we're working in concert, of course, with our allied trading nations. But how do we keep the dirty players out? And how, furthermore, do we promote the use of the clean materials within? And so that speaks to the concept of green procurement, ensuring that we're buying materials and using our collective purchasing power to further improve the overall carbon footprint for the world, frankly, not just our country. Challenge number 3. No industry or government can undertake the scale of transformation required in our economy alone. So I think Bentley touched on this point as well. From our vantage point, we have a shared ambition with the government for net zero, but we cannot do it alone. In fact, in our industry, we require those system changes of things like a hydrogen economy, of more clean electricity, of reliable clean electricity. And we stand ready to leverage what we do have, which is very large market pull. We are a very significant consumer of energy products, of these other materials. So we believe we can bring that market pull perspective to the table. And we want to work with all levels of government, stakeholders, key academics. We need as many brains and creative thinkers as possible on this journey. So with that, I hope those 3 challenges can be flipped around to become opportunities for our country. Thanks.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much, Catherine. I mean, I would love to see a great story on the challenges we have in getting procurement policy in place in this country. I know, Mike, we've organized sessions on this in the past, and boy, if there's one thing that we could do better, I would say it's coming up with large government procurement policies that recognize domestic green products. A little editorializing here. Matthew, you're running an exciting new initiative called Accelerate. It's a electric vehicle supply chain alliance. It seems like the electric vehicle market is taking off, but I wonder if you could tell us more specifically why you think Canada's zero-emission vehicle industry is well positioned for competitiveness, and what do we need to do to position ourselves to be real ZEV leaders?
Sure. So, and thanks, Bruce, and thanks everybody for coming in, the organizers for inviting me. I just want to pick up on Catherine's theme of challenges versus opportunities. I'm going to focus on opportunities because this is really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Canada to build a zero-emission vehicle industry. We, relative to pretty much every other jurisdiction I can think of, are better positioned to build an industry from the critical minerals through to the battery materials to manufacturing parts and obviously assembling vehicles. We've got the minerals, we know that. We've got the researchers in this country who are designing the next generation of batteries. We've got an auto sector, an auto parts sector that is world class. We are so well positioned to do something special. So that's the opportunity. Now let's talk about the challenges. So if you look at, and this is kind of picking up on what Bentley was talking about, if you look at what is happening around the world with industrial strategy. You're seeing South Korea, you're seeing Germany, you're seeing Australia, you're seeing the US, really thinking through what success looks like for them. In the EU, for example, they know what they're driving at. They know how many people they want employed in the battery sector. They know how much they're going to invest. They know what the ROI looks like on that investment. Same thing in the US. It's a different model that they're pursuing, but it's still industrial policy. That's not an approach that we've taken yet in Canada. It's an approach we can take, and it's an approach we should take, and we'll talk about that more, I'm sure. What we've been doing is, pursuing FDI opportunities, which is a really smart thing to do. The government has been going around the world and saying, look at what Canada has. Look at the opportunity in front of you, investor, and it's paying off. We have to make sure, though, that that's not the sum total of the effort, right? We have to make sure that we're creating the economic multiplying opportunities up and down the value chain, so that our auto sector, our vehicle sector, isn't Southern Ontario based forever, right? And that we obviously still have an auto sector 20, 30 years from now, but that it's a national industry, right? That involves mining, it involves processing, it involves battery manufacturing, it involves AI and technology, it involves battery recycling, and that can be across the country. And this can be a national champion industry if we put our minds to it. But by putting our minds to it, I think what we need to do is sit down and figure out what success looks like. We need to think through, all right, by 2040, Canada wants to be this in zero-emission vehicles, right? Do we just want to be assembling cars? Probably not. Do we just want to be, digging stuff out of the ground and selling it on? Probably not, right? So what do we want to do? What percentage of our GDP is going to be attributed to zero-emission vehicles, right? Let's figure that out. Let's, how much lithium do we want to be producing? How much manganese and all these critical minerals? How many batteries? How many gigawatt hours is going to be, is Canada going to be accountable for in the future? We have to think this through so that we can work backwards and figure out what the tasks look like, what the investments look like, what the incentives look like, who's going to be accountable for what, against what time frame. That's what a strategy is. That's what you would expect, a CEO to be accountable for, right? That's what that looks like. And so if we think that through, and if we put industry together with government and with the NGOs and with academics, we can actually do this. It's not something that Canada is particularly great at doing. We don't have that muscle like other countries have, but we have much more of an opportunity than other countries have got here. So I would just sort of leave on the message that this is a huge opportunity for the country. It can replace a lot of what we're going to lose over the next few generations in terms of wealth. And I just want to end on this note. We talk a lot about economic activity and creating wealth. What that really means, and I think this is lost in a lot of conversations, that means creating opportunities and good quality of life for our kids and their kids and their kids after that. That's what that means. It's making sure that Canada is the place that we have known it to be, for future generations. So we have to think that through. What are people going to be doing? What industries are going to be important in this country? So I'll just end it there.
Right. Thanks, Matthew. It's a really clear and pragmatic sense of what those opportunities can look like. I'm going to open it now for discussion, and anyone from the media who would like to answer a question of the panelists, Carrie has a microphone. Please signal. And in the meantime, I'm going to ask one question while you formulate your thoughts and get ready to ask Carrie for her microphone. And it's a question for Bentley. I mean, one of the big challenges that not only do we face in this country, but in other parts of the world is the politicization of climate change, the politicization of net zero. We're seeing people now running anti-ESG campaigns, which we were joking earlier today, the left and the right are both running anti-ESG campaigns. So I think the ESG branding people have an issue. But it is very complicated. But for us, we're just basically looking at this in a nonpartisan way to help the future of industrial success in Canada. With Pierre Poilievre now running the Conservative Party of Canada, how would you, Bentley, kind of position this so that they can see the benefits of these policies and whether it's focused just on competitiveness or supporting transition to net zero, but how would you approach it?
Yeah, I think, first of all, the first thing to say is just that economic crisis is not a partisan issue. This is something that any party that's in power in this government is going to have to grapple with, right? The export table is a bipartisan issue. This isn't something that needs to be owned by anybody. The energy crisis doesn't care what party is in power. The energy transition doesn't care what party is in power. And I think at this point, the transition is baked in. It's baked in because thermodynamically, the energy system that we're going to create is going to be more effective, more cheap, better for the environment, better for people, better for consumers. And so it's going to happen at this point. And the question is, what do we do about that? And the Conservative Party of Canada better have a darn good answer to that question, just like any other party should have a darn good answer to that question. And again, as I said on industrial policy, a lot of the time, industrial policy is conflated as a centralized top-down government thing, but that's absolutely not the case. There are just as many forms of industrial policy that can be pursued by governments on the right. I think if you look at what the Inflation Reduction Act is, I would call that from an academic perspective, that's a pretty nationalist, protectionist industrial policy. It looks like a classic right-wing set of policies. You've got tax credits attached to border local content requirements, border restrictions, right? And if you put that together, that sounds a lot like 19th century conservatism. That's exactly what the roadmap was at that time. So I think that there are lots of ways to do industrial policy, and industrial policy is not defined by the economic tools that you bring to it, but the intents and the aims that you bring to it. And I think in either case, any party that is serious about the future of this country needs to have a clear statement of what it thinks the economic future of these industries on the export table is going to be. And I don't think that's a question for one party or another, or something that one party or another should be concerned about.
Great, thank you. And we do have a question. Please go ahead.
Hi, Carl Meyer, the Narwhal. Thanks to everybody for your comments. Very interesting. Similar kind of question. I wonder if you could address the issues, I guess, around federalism. We've seen in the last few years, perhaps the federal government wants to go in one direction and some of the provinces want to go in a very different direction. And that's not always necessarily a political issue. It's also just the structure of the federation. So interested in your thoughts.
I'm going to bet we all have thoughts on that, but go ahead, Matthew.
I'll start. I mean, look, in zero-emission vehicles, you're actually sort of seeing a race to the top a little bit. You're seeing the Ontario government trying to position itself as a champion. You've seen the Quebec government position itself as a champion. You've seen the federal government trying to position itself as a champion of this. So that's not a bad thing, right? When you sort of dig into the details and how you get some of this stuff done from a national perspective, it becomes a little bit more challenging because, if you think of mining, for example, there are both, federal and provincial implications there and regulations that need to be thought through and streamlined, I guess is a fair way of thinking about it. And that would just be one example. So, but, if just in my industry, if you can position it as a national champion industry, right, then all this, and that benefits many regions of the country, then you can start sorting through who's going to do what, who's going to benefit, and work from there. So I don't think we're in a bad place necessarily, but the devil's going to be in the detail for sure.
Great. Catherine or Bentley?
I would just add when in my experience, when we're under threat, that's real, and I'm talking about, of course, some history between Canada and the US on steel. We were able to overcome the challenges in federalism that you're pointing out. And, on the big risk issues, I remain hopeful that, common sense of a united front on some of those big challenges, especially in today's context where we're looking at the energy security challenges and the climate risks, et cetera. So, I guess I'm going to be glass half full on this one.
I mean, one of the things we found when we did a study of Canada's top economic opportunities in the energy transition that was funded by the Ivey Foundation is that there are opportunities for every single part of this country, and it's not actually difficult to figure out what those opportunities are. And maybe some of those opportunities aren't as big in dollar terms as the opportunity in electric vehicles, but they're just as important to the future of this country and to the benefits and well-being of Canadians. And so we need to have a broad portfolio that looks at all regions of the country and takes that seriously. And I think the government is doing that through the regional energy tables that they're convening. I think they're trying to have that conversation, and I think that that's good. But I think the key is, how do we create collaboration between the provinces and the federal government in a way that's more productive? And there, I think the European Commission and the way that it operates is actually really interesting, because the European Commission is actually a weak federal government, if you want to think about it that way. And all of the member states of the EU are kind of like the provinces that have their own funding pots. And they need to be kind of corralled into a dynamic where they're collaborating, but nonetheless still making strategic decisions. And the EU was able to do that. And if they can get the complexity of that polity under control to create a very clear battery strategy and a very clear hydrogen strategy that is leading to insane levels of investment in both those supply chains. And I'm pretty sure we can figure it out here.
Okay. Matthew.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one point. I think that's an excellent point. And framing this as a crisis, which it is really important. If you think back to December of last year with the Build Back Better legislation that turned into the IRA, you saw premiers of different political parties going down to Washington and saying, no, this is a national imperative. Same thing when in the renegotiation of NAFTA. And so, a crisis actually focuses the mind.
Great,
Yeah.
thanks. Jeff?
Yep. Hi, Jeff Bean with iPolitics. I just want to go back to something what Catherine said about keeping dirty players out. Wanted everyone's thoughts on just like how would you like to see the federal government sort of do that?
I went first last time, so.
Well, I can reiterate
Yeah.
the points that I was making because I think, we've been, of course, seized with this because it's actually eroding our market share today. And as we transform, we're deeply concerned, how this is going to continue at an accelerated pace. So, the solutions we see are to provide a series of incentives and deterrents. So incentives for those that are producing materials that are of, at lowest carbon footprint achievable, what have you, and using that as a tool to promote and support those that are taking the correct action. And then the sort of stick, if you will, for those that aren't, just not letting them in or not letting them in, free, but applying something like a carbon tax, let's call it, or carbon tariff. Maybe it's a border carbon adjustment. That's the tool that's getting a lot of play, obviously, but that sort of thing. So it's kind of we see a dual pronged strategy for dealing with that problem. But open to other suggestions too.
I think you see that across industries, right? I think you see that in the biofuels market, where the carbon intensity of the fuel is actually what determines the price that you pay. And I think it's going to be pretty similar in batteries, where the lowest carbon intensity produced batteries, looking at the whole supply chain, which has been the European Union is developing a footprinting program for that, and the US and Canada could certainly collaborate with the European Union on that. And you can, again, look across all sectors, and I think that this is going to be a real driver, and it's going to be a way to try to keep China's products out. And that's going to work for a while. I just think the West has to be ready for the moment at which China can clear under those carbon border adjustments. Because if there's one thing that China has shown us is that they know how to invest and they know how to build net zero supply chains. And so we just have to be really smart and strategic about it. And it needs to be, a national discussion about what actually is international order going to look like. The Inflation Reduction Act is against international law. Like, it blows a giant hole right in the middle of the World Trade Organization, and it's not clear what the fallout of that is going to be. And it's really critically important to the economic future of this country that we figure out what that fallout is going to look like and what Canada's strategy within that is going to be.
The only thing I'd add, and I agree with everything that's been said, is another way of maybe thinking through that question is, well, instead of keeping the dirty players out, as you put it, why aren't we investing in the clean players inside, right? So we need to be kind of growing Canadian firms and Canadian expertise and Canadian IP so that we can actually have the capacity internally. It's not going to complete everything. It's 37 million people if we are what we are. But at the same time, we can be doing a heck of a lot more than we've been doing, at least in our industry, and I think across all the industries we're talking about.
Great, thanks. We're getting close to the end. Just wondering if yes. Great.
Hi, Heather Schofield from the Toronto Star. I'm just intrigued about your thoughts about industrial strategy, and I feel like the government talks a lot about that. They would probably argue that they have one, and that they have had one over the years, maybe not as overt as you'd like, but it's becoming more and more overt. But clearly, you're looking for something more. But how do you get from here to there? And how is it? Does the Strategic Innovation Fund, for example, not count as industrial strategy? And is it even a stepping stone to get to where you want to be?
Great, thanks, Heather. Bentley?
I mean, on the formal academic definition, we would need to see some targeting of the Strategic Innovation Fund in order for it to count as an industrial policy instrument. But the way that it's set up is that it's largely passive. It just receives applications. It doesn't have any strategic targets. It doesn't have any active role that it takes. And so for me, the key definition between having a bunch of funding programs or having a subsidy regime and having an industrial policy is that A, you're making a strategy before you make investment decisions, and then you actually make active investment decisions. So those two things are kind of, I think, both missing. And in some cases, we have them happening partially or a little bit or once, in some cases, but not in others. But you don't see that happening across the board, both those things happening. And so to me, those are really missing pieces. And I do agree, of course, that the government has done a lot to invest in these net zero supply chains, and that has primed and created the possibility of creating a clean tech powerhouse in this country. But the question is whether all those ingredients really add up to a meal, and an industrial strategy helps you do that. Setting clear targets that everybody knows exactly what's going to happen in the supply chain and allowing the companies to partake. I mean, I think this is something that Catherine can speak to more is, are companies and the government really working together to set those targets? Or is the regulatory regime and the policy regime happening largely within government itself and not as part of a strategic collaboration where we can do an all of society approach, where we're really driving with everybody moving together in lockstep, where finance, industry, government, First Nations, labor, all the actors are at the table because they all know what the plan is because we said it out loud in a public target, right? And some of this stuff is like the government is clearly doing it. They are clearly going to deliver on this battery strategy that they have kept secret to themselves. But they're not going to get the political credit for it that they could have gotten if they had publicly announced that we're going to build a supply chain with 100 gigawatts of batteries. And guess what? We're going to do the minerals too. If they had announced that in advance, half of the punditry and half of the town would have laughed at them. And that would have been a difficult moment for the government to get through. But they're on the doorstep of delivering it. And they didn't say that they were going to do it. So no one's going to give them credit for doing it, right? So the number one economic achievement of the last 2 years of this government has been effectively wasted because they didn't lay out a target and a strategy in public because they did it behind closed doors. And they've missed out on investment that they otherwise would have had in nickel mines and lithium mines and everything else if they had made that public. If everyone knew the demand pull was coming, then they would have gotten their own investments lined up even without the government. So I think there's a big difference between making investments here, there, and having an industrial strategy where everything's on the table, everybody knows what's going on. And we're making a play and everybody knows what the play is. And we're gonna have to revise that in 6 months because the world's gonna undo it. There'll be another war or something else, but we'll be able to get there. I'm talking fast because I have to go catch a plane.
Yeah, that was rapid fire. That was a great question, and if I could weigh in as well, I just want to add the perspective. Certainly those are you mentioned SIF and the NZA. Those are really important. There's no question about it, and they really have started us on the path again. Just to reiterate. So low-hanging fruit, lots of good stuff is going. For me, what's missing, two things. One is the scale of the change now that we as a nation have determined we're going to be net zero, as opposed to focused on sort of incremental reductions, number one. And number two is really the system solutions. They're missing still. Lots of us across many industries are looking for, where is that affordable hydrogen going to come from? How is it going to actually take shape? There's been a lot of talk, not a lot of reality on that yet, but we need to keep going on those big system issues.
Yeah, and 2 quick points that Bentley can make his play. I would say that one, just to pick up on your point about targets, we need to know what success looks like. What are we driving at? Like, that's what a strategy is, right? And I don't think anybody's defined that yet. So we've seen some good news announcements, certainly in the EV space in Canada, and they are good news announcements. But what is it? What's the end goal here? And that's what a strategy really is. It's like figuring out how you're going to get to that end goal, whatever you define that success to be. So we need to do that. The other point, though, is it's not just government, right? Like, everybody sort of looks at government and says, spend more money, do this, do that. Absolutely, there's a huge role to play there, but it's industry as well, and it's other stakeholders in this ecosystem that need to be leaning in to get it right. So it's industry, it's NGOs, it's academics, it's First Nations, because we all have a stake in its success, so we should be defining it together.
Great, thanks. And Bentley reminded me of why we all need to stay for the reception, because that's when we all get really worked up. But David, so happy to see you, and you have our final question of the day.
I'm honored, Canada's National Observer. I have a political question. Maybe I can just get a quick response from each of you. We've heard a picture of the crisis. There was reference to what's happening down south. During that 2.0, there was a Team Canada approach. Everyone came together.
Yeah.
Industry, government, parties of different persuasions, et cetera, et cetera. Can that happen in the fight against this crisis? And if that can happen, what are you looking for?
Look, I said it before. I think nothing focuses the mind like a crisis, and we have seen those approaches before, and not just in the last couple of years. I think it's happened over time, right? Think back to the original free trade negotiations. So yes, it can happen. I think, I'll be bold and say actually this should be a part of the issue, right? And it's a race to the top in that sense. Like who's going to be more partisan about this and make this a better, strategy for a better economy. And that should be the debate as opposed to, the opposite.
And I'm not sure we've seen the full, we've seen certainly the climate crisis, but I don't know that we've seen the full competitiveness crisis yet. And if we don't keep pace with, some of our big allied nations and our trading partners and others, we are going to be left behind, and that will create a crisis of an economic crisis of huge proportion to be coupled with our climate crisis. So, my thoughts, as I expressed in my remarks, are we have some work to do to bring our incentives, our regulatory regime, our procurement policies, et cetera, to be at pace and where they need to be. Thanks.
Yeah, I think Team Canada's approach is a really great way to put it. And what gives me a lot of optimism that it can happen is that I think there's really strong alignment in our work between what industry thinks is absolutely necessary, what the government would actually like to be doing, but maybe just doesn't have the time or doesn't really know what those modes of government work actually look like. And I think those are the most common questions actually that we get when we brief out policymakers on this stuff is like, we just don't have a tradition of collaborative strategy making in this country. So how do we do it? What's the first step? It's very practical. Like we just don't know how to do this. And then those two things are really aligned with what experts are saying is actually this is what we have to do. And so I think when you have those three things and you can deliver real economic benefits to First Nations communities all across the country because they're really well positioned in a lot of these economic opportunities. And guess what? The labor unions love it because they need to retool all these industries and they know where their jobs are and they've seen the export table and they know how scary that is. I think you've got all parts of society ready to take this really, really seriously. And bankers know what money smells like, so I think they're on board too.
Great. Okay, thanks so much. With that, if we could give the panel a big round of applause. Thank you so much. And there are a couple more comments. Bentley's busting to get to the airport.
I'm going.
Are you gonna run?
I'm gonna run.
Okay, Bentley, thank you so much,
you,
Bentley. And I will tell you right now that in addition to how you can get in touch with Bentley, we've got a couple of things that we've put together as part of this event. Before I explain that, so there's sort of the personal side of it, which is the people in the room today. And I want to thank and point out from various organizations in the country. We have my co-author and close friend, Rick Smith, head of the Climate Institute of Canada, Canadian Climate Institute. We have Dan Wicklum, CEO of the Transition Accelerator and co-chair of the National Net Zero Advisory Body. Corey Diamond from Efficiency Canada, thanks Corey. Mike Wilson, Smart Prosperity. Mike from Seed Change, Executive Director Amma Diawao, thanks Amma for coming. And beside Amma, Katie Ward from the National Farmers Union we work with closely. Clean Economy Fund, our new Executive Director, Eric Campbell, there's Eric in the back. Fortier Family Foundation Executive Director, Eric St. Pierre. And let's see, I think that's all I see here. And I'm also going to point out one of our, I don't know if spiritual leader is the right term for you, James, but James Meadowcroft has been so critical to all of our work. James based here in Carleton, so thank you, James, for coming and all the wonderful work you've done for us. So that's the in-person part. We encourage you to chat with anyone over drinks with this fabulous group. And in addition to this, pretty much all of those people and others are on a new media center that the Ivey Foundation has created specifically to connect people to experts under all of the various subject headings that we've heard. So we had a lot of depth today, but believe me, we have just scratched the surface. There is unbelievable complexity and some great ideas behind all of this. So please check out the Media Center at ivy.org, our website. All of today's panelists, including myself, are available for one-on-one interviews by request. Jess Harris, standing with Carrie. Jess Harris is our communications director. Jess and Carrie organized the event today. Thanks so much. You guys did a brilliant job. Now I was once told if you're going to have a media briefing, make sure there's food and drinks afterwards. So we have food and drinks here, and I really do encourage you to stay, chat with whoever you like. But thank you so much, all of you, for coming and the great questions. Thanks so much.